The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey like tears that refused to fall. In the distance, church bells tolled, with a rhythm that seemed to match the collective heartbeat of a nation holding its breath. This was not just another royal ceremony or state occasion. This was the day when King Charles III would lead his people through one of the most profound moments of remembrance in modern British history. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the London fog, millions across the United Kingdom and around the world prepared to witness something extraordinary. Not the pomp and circumstance of a coronation, nor the celebration of a jubilee, but the raw, unguarded moment when a king would show his people how to grieve, how to remember, and how to find hope in the darkest of times. The story that unfolds is not one written in history books or planned by palace officials. It is the true account of 24 hours that would define a reign, heal a nation, and prove that sometimes the most powerful thing a monarch can do is simply be human when humanity needs it most. This is the story of how King Charles III guided his country through a moment that would be remembered long after the last flower had been laid and the final prayer had been spoken. The telephone rang at precisely 4:47 a.m. in the private study at Clarence House. King Charles III had been awake for nearly an hour, as was his custom, reviewing the morning briefings and correspondence that never seemed to diminish regardless of the early hour. The red leather folder containing the most urgent matters lay open before him, but his attention was drawn immediately to the distinctive ringtone that indicated a call from number 10 Downing Street. Private Secretary Sir Clive Alderton appeared in the doorway within moments, his usually composed expression betraying the gravity of the situation. Charles had worked with Alderton long enough to read the subtle signs of distress that most would miss entirely. The slight tightening around the eyes, the almost imperceptible pause before speaking, the way his hand hesitated before reaching for the secure phone. "Your Majesty," Alderton said quietly, "the Prime Minister is on the line. There has been an incident." Charles set down his fountain pen and reached for the phone, his mind already racing through possibilities. In the 18 months since his accession to the throne, he had received many such calls. Natural disasters, terrorist threats, political crises, each one requiring careful consideration and measured response. But something in Alderton's tone suggested this was different. The Prime Minister's voice was steady but strained. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid I have devastating news. At approximately 11:30 p.m. last night, a coach carrying members of the Royal British Legion returning from a memorial service in northern France was involved in a serious accident on the M25. The initial report suggested minor injuries, but as rescue efforts continued through the night, the situation has proven far more grave than first thought." Charles felt the familiar weight that settled in his chest whenever tragedy touched the lives of his subjects. These were not abstract casualties or statistics to be managed. These were real people, with families and stories and dreams that had been suddenly, violently interrupted. "How many?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. 43 veterans and their families were on board. 27 have been confirmed dead. 16 others are in critical condition at hospitals across London and Surrey. Your Majesty, many of these were men and women who had served in recent conflicts. Some had only recently returned from Afghanistan and Iraq. Others were veterans of the Falklands, Northern Ireland, even a few who served in the final years of national service. The silence stretched between them as Charles absorbed the magnitude of the loss. These were not just citizens. They were people who had answered their country's call to service, who had risked everything in defense of the realm he was sworn to protect. The irony was bitter and sharp. They had survived wars and conflicts only to perish on a motorway while returning from honoring their fallen comrades. "The families?" Charles asked. "We are in the process of notification now." Many of the passengers were attending the service together. Husbands and wives, parents and children who had served alongside each other or were continuing family traditions of service. "Some entire family lines have been affected, Your Majesty." Charles closed his eyes and felt the familiar burden of kingship settle more heavily upon his shoulders. This was not about protocol or procedure. This was about finding the right words when there were no right words, about providing comfort when comfort seemed impossible, about leading a nation through grief when he himself felt overwhelmed by the scale of the tragedy. "I want to visit the families," he said without hesitation. "All of them. And the survivors in hospital." "What do we know about the cause?" The Prime Minister's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Preliminary investigations suggest mechanical failure, but the full inquiry will take weeks to complete." "Your Majesty, I should mention that the media has already begun coverage. The story broke on social media around 2 a.m. from witnesses at the scene. and by dawn, every major news outlet will be running with it. The palace communications team is coordinating with Number 10 on the official response. Charles nodded, though the gesture went unseen through the phone. He was already mentally reviewing his schedule for the coming days, considering what could be postponed or cancelled. But more than that, he was thinking about the broader implications of this tragedy. The veterans community in the United Kingdom had faced significant challenges in recent years. Budget cuts to support services, debates about the treatment of former service personnel, ongoing struggles with mental health, and transition to civilian life. This accident would not just be mourned as a tragic loss of life, it would become a focal point for all the unresolved tensions and unaddressed needs of those who had served their country. Prime Minister, Charles said carefully, this cannot be just another royal visit or ceremonial appearance. These families, this community, they deserve more than protocol. They need to know that their service and sacrifice are truly understood and valued, not just acknowledged with formal statements. I agree completely, Your Majesty. What do you propose? Charles was quiet for a long moment, considering. Through the window of his study, he could see the early morning light beginning to illuminate the London skyline. Somewhere across the city, families were receiving the worst news of their lives. Hospital staff were working frantically to save lives that hung in the balance. Emergency responders were dealing with the aftermath of a scene that would haunt them for years to come. I want to spend time with each family individually, not as part of a formal program, but as genuine meetings. I want to understand who these people were, what their lives meant, what they hoped for their children and grandchildren. And I want to ensure that the survivors and the families left behind receive every possible support, not just in the immediate aftermath, but for as long as they need it. The Prime Minister was quiet for a moment before responding. Your Majesty, that level of personal involvement, it would be unprecedented. The logistics alone would be enormously complex, and the emotional toll on you personally would be significant. Charles understood the concern. Royal protocol existed partly to protect the monarchy from becoming too emotionally invested in individual tragedies, however heartbreaking. The sovereign was expected to provide symbolic leadership and comfort while maintaining the necessary distance to serve the broader national interest. But Charles had spent his entire life preparing for the moment when he would need to balance the demands of duty with the call of conscience, and he knew instinctively that this was such a moment. I am not concerned about the emotional toll, he said firmly. I am concerned about failing these families and this community when they need their king most. Schedule whatever meetings are necessary with the palace staff, the government, and the military leadership. I want to understand every aspect of this tragedy and every possible way we can respond appropriately. After ending the call with the Prime Minister, Charles remained sitting in the quiet of his study as the weight of the morning's news settled around him. He thought about the phone calls that were being made across the country at that very moment. The knock on doors that would forever divide families' lives into before and after. He thought about the children who would grow up without parents, the spouses who had lost their partners, the parents who would bury their children. Alderton appeared again in the doorway, carrying a fresh pot of tea and a folder of updated briefings. Your Majesty, the Palace Communications team is requesting guidance on the initial statement. They have prepared several drafts for your review. Charles waved aside the folder. Later. Right now, I need you to clear my schedule for the next week. Cancel the state dinner with the Norwegian delegation, postpone the opening of the new children's hospital in Manchester, and reschedule the Commonwealth meetings. Send appropriate apologies and explanations, but make it clear that this takes precedence over everything else. Alderton made notes quickly, though Charles could see the concern in his expression. The cancelled events represented months of diplomatic and logistical planning and would disappoint thousands of people who had prepared for the king's visits. But Charles had learned long ago that kingship sometimes required making difficult choices about where to direct limited time and attention. Sir, Alderton said carefully, perhaps we should consider a more measured approach. A single large memorial service, coordinated with the government and military leadership, might allow you to honor the victims while maintaining your other commitments. Charles looked up from the papers scattered across his desk and met Alderton's eyes directly. These people died returning from honoring their fallen comrades. They were keeping faith with the memory of those who had served before them. The very least I can do is keep faith with them and their families now. If that means disappointing some dignitaries or rescheduling some ceremonies, so be it. The firmness in his voice left no room for argument, and Alderton nodded with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to translate the king's wishes into practical action, regardless of the complexity involved. As his private secretary left to begin the enormous task of reorganizing the royal schedule, Charles remained alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that the coming days would test not just his ability to provide comfort and leadership, but his understanding of what it truly meant to be a king in the modern world. Outside, London was beginning to wake up to news that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. But inside the quiet study at Clarence House, King Charles III was already planning how to ensure that this tragedy would not be defined solely by loss, but by the nation's response to that loss and the way it chose to honor those who had served and died in service to others. The morning light grew stronger, and with it came the first of many phone calls that would transform a personal tragedy into a national moment of reckoning and, ultimately, healing. By 9 a.m., King Charles was walking through the sterile corridors of St. Thomas's Hospital, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. He had insisted on visiting the survivors before meeting with the bereaved families, feeling that those fighting for their lives deserved to know they had not been forgotten in the larger tragedy unfolding around them. The hospital staff had worked through the night to prepare for the royal visit, but Charles had made it clear that he wanted no fanfare, no formal presentations. He wanted to meet with patients and families quietly, personally, without the usual protocol that surrounded such visits. The only concessions to security were the discreet presence of his protection officers, and the fact that the wing had been temporarily cleared of media and non-essential personnel. Dr. Sarah Matthews, the chief trauma surgeon who had operated on several of the accident victims, met him at the entrance to the intensive care unit. She was a woman in her early 40s with tired eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Her surgical scrubs had been replaced with a clean white coat, but Charles could see the exhaustion that comes from performing multiple emergency surgeries in succession. "Your Majesty," she said with a slight bow, "thank you for coming. I should prepare you for what you're about to see. Several of our patients are still in critical condition, and some may not be fully conscious. The families have been here all night, and they're understandably distraught." Charles nodded, understanding the gravity of what lay ahead. "Doctor, please understand that I'm not here as a ceremonial visitor. I want to spend real time with these families, to listen to their concerns and understand how we can better support them. If that means staying longer than planned or disrupting your schedules, please don't hesitate to tell me what you need." Dr. Matthews led him to the first room, where 34-year-old former Royal Marine James Patterson lay connected to multiple machines that monitored his vital signs with electronic beeps and digital readouts. James had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had been traveling with his wife Sarah and their 8-year-old daughter Emma to the memorial service in France. Sarah had been killed instantly in the accident, and Emma was in a pediatric ward 3 floors above, with a broken leg and severe emotional trauma. James's parents, Margaret and Robert Patterson, sat beside his bed, holding his hands and speaking to him in low, encouraging voices despite the doctor's uncertainty about whether he could hear them. They looked up as Charles entered, and he could see in their faces the particular exhaustion that comes from maintaining hope in the face of almost unbearable circumstances. "Please, don't get up," Charles said gently as they began to rise. "I'm here to see how James is doing, and to learn about your family." Margaret Patterson was a retired teacher in her 60s, and her husband Robert had worked for 30 years in a factory that manufactured parts for military vehicles. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, trying to navigate a medical crisis while simultaneously grieving the loss of their daughter-in-law and caring for their traumatized granddaughter. "He's a fighter, Your Majesty," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "He survived 2 deployments, came home safe when so many didn't. It doesn't seem right that he should be hurt like this on a motorway in England." Charles pulled up a chair beside the bed and sat down, ignoring the surprised looks from hospital staff who were accustomed to royal visits that followed more formal protocols. He spent the next 20 minutes listening as Margaret and Robert told him about their son's military service, his struggles with adjusting to civilian life, his deep love for his wife and daughter, and his commitment to supporting other veterans through his work with local charity organizations. "He organized the coach trip," Robert explained. "Every year, he put together these memorial visits for veterans and their families who couldn't afford to travel to France on their own. He said it was important for the younger generation to understand what had been sacrificed for their freedom." The irony was devastating and obvious, but Charles could see that the family needed to talk about James as he was, not as another victim of a tragic accident. He asked questions about James's interests, his hopes for Emma's future, his plans for expanding the veteran support work he had been doing. When Dr. Matthews appeared in the doorway to indicate that it was time to move on, Charles asked if he could have a few more minutes. "James," he said, leaning closer to the unconscious man, "your parents have told me about the work you've been doing to help other veterans. When you wake up, I want to discuss how we can support and expand that work. Your country is proud of your service, and we're going to make sure you have everything you need for your recovery." The next room contained 67-year-old retired Army Colonel Patricia Henley, who had been travelling with her son Michael, a current serving officer in the Parachute Regiment. Michael had been killed in the accident, and Patricia had suffered severe internal injuries that would require multiple surgeries. She was awake but heavily sedated, and her sister Jennifer sat beside her bed reading aloud from letters that had arrived from military units around the world expressing condolences and support. Patricia had served in Northern Ireland during the height of the Troubles, and had been one of the first women to achieve senior rank in the British Army. After retirement, she had become a prominent advocate for veterans' rights, and had written extensively about the challenges facing women in military service. Her son Michael had followed her into the army, and had been preparing for his third deployment to Eastern Europe as part of NATO peacekeeping operations. "She keeps asking about Michael," Jennifer whispered to Charles as they stood beside the bed. "The doctors said we should wait until she's stronger before telling her, but she knows something is wrong. She's too intelligent and too experienced to be fooled by evasive answers." Charles considered this carefully. He had dealt with grief and loss throughout his life, but the complexity of this situation was particularly challenging. Patricia was not just a bereaved mother. She was a military professional who understood the realities of service and sacrifice better than most. Treating her as a fragile patient who needed to be protected from the truth might be more harmful than honest communication. "Has she asked to speak with me directly?" he inquired. Jennifer nodded. "When she heard you were coming, she made me promise to wake her up when you arrived, no matter what the nurses said." Charles approached the bed and spoke Patricia's name softly. Her eyes opened immediately, and despite the effects of medication and trauma, her gaze was sharp and focused. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice weak but clear. "Thank you for coming. I need you to tell me about Michael." The directness of the request caught Charles slightly off guard, but he recognized the tone of someone who had spent decades making and receiving difficult reports about casualties and losses. This was not a grieving mother seeking false comfort. This was a professional soldier requesting an honest briefing about a situation that affected her family and her unit. "Patricia," he said carefully, "your son died in the accident. I'm told it was instantaneous and that he would not have suffered. I'm also told that he was trying to help other passengers when the accident occurred. The preliminary reports suggest that he saved at least 2 lives before he was fatally injured." Patricia closed her eyes and was quiet for a long moment. When she opened them again, tears were flowing down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "That sounds like Michael," she said. "He always said that leadership meant being the first to face danger and the last to seek safety. I'm proud of him, Your Majesty, and I'm proud that he died as he lived, in service to others." Charles spent another 15 minutes with Patricia, discussing Michael's military career, his plans for promotion, his commitment to mentoring younger soldiers, and his deep respect for his mother's pioneering role in the army. When he prepared to leave, Patricia asked him to lean closer. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "please don't let this accident become just another tragedy that people forget after a few weeks of news coverage. These people, the ones who died and the ones still fighting to live, they represent something important about service and sacrifice. Use this moment to remind the country what it means to serve something larger than yourself." As Charles moved through the hospital, visiting each survivor and meeting with their families, he began to understand that Patricia's request was not unique. Every family he met expressed some version of the same desire, that their loved ones' deaths and injuries should mean something beyond the immediate tragedy, that the accident should serve as a reminder of the values and commitments that had brought these people together on that coach in the first place. In the pediatric ward, he spent nearly an hour with Emma Patterson, James's 8-year-old daughter, who had survived the accident with relatively minor physical injuries but was struggling with trauma and the knowledge that her mother had died. She was a bright, articulate child who asked direct questions about death and loss that challenged Charles to provide honest answers that a child could understand and accept. "Will Daddy wake up?" she asked, holding a stuffed animal that had been brought from home. "The doctors are doing everything they can to help him," Charles replied. "He's very sick right now, but everyone here is working to make him better. What I can promise you is that no matter what happens, there will always be people who care about you and will make sure you're safe and loved." Emma considered this seriously before asking, "Are you going to help the other children whose mommies and daddies died?" The question struck Charles deeply, because it reminded him that this tragedy extended far beyond the immediate victims. There were dozens of children across the country who would grow up with the effects of this single moment on a dark highway. Some had lost one parent, others had lost both, and still others would grow up with parents who were forever changed by physical injuries or emotional trauma.
"Yes," he told Emma with absolute certainty.
"That's exactly what I'm going to do." By the time Charles left St. Thomas's Hospital, it was past 2 p.m. and he was already running late for scheduled meetings with bereaved families at a hotel near Victoria Station. But the morning had provided him with something invaluable, a deeper understanding of the human reality behind the statistics and headlines, and a clearer sense of what the country owed to these families and to the broader community of veterans and service members they represented. As his car moved through London traffic toward the next appointment, Charles reflected on the conversations he had just concluded. Each family had faced their crisis differently, but all of them had demonstrated a resilience and grace that he found both humbling and inspiring. More importantly, they had articulated something that he was beginning to understand as his responsibility in this situation, to ensure that their losses contributed to positive change rather than simply adding to the long list of tragedies that the country had experienced over the years. The afternoon would bring even more challenging conversations with families who had lost loved ones entirely, but the morning had given him a framework for approaching those meetings with the combination of empathy, honesty, and practical commitment that these circumstances demanded. The Westminster Bridge Hotel had been chosen for the afternoon meetings, not for its luxury or convenience, but because it could provide the privacy and flexibility needed for what Charles knew would be emotionally demanding conversations. The hotel staff had worked with palace officials to create individual meeting spaces where families could speak privately with the king without feeling rushed or overwhelmed by the presence of other grieving relatives. Charles arrived at 2:30 p.m. to find that many of the families had been waiting for hours, some having travelled from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to be present. The hotel manager, Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, met him at a side entrance to avoid the media gathered at the front of the building. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "we have prepared 6 separate meeting rooms as requested. The families have been offered refreshments, but most have declined. They seem focused entirely on the opportunity to speak with you about their loved ones." As Charles walked through the hotel corridors, he could see families gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones and comforting children who clearly did not fully understand why they were in this unfamiliar place wearing their best clothes in the middle of a weekday. The sight reminded him powerfully of the gatherings that followed royal funerals, but with the crucial difference that these families had received no preparation for their loss and no time to process what had happened to them. The first meeting was with the family of Thomas and Helen Richardson, a married couple in their 70s who had been active in veterans affairs for decades. Thomas had served in the Royal Navy during the final years of the Cold War, and Helen had worked as a nurse at military hospitals before starting a family. Their 3 adult children, David, Susan, and Mark, had all gathered to represent the family in meeting with the king. David Richardson, the eldest son and a doctor himself, spoke first. "Your Majesty, thank you for taking the time to meet with us individually. My parents would have been honoured to know that their deaths led to this kind of attention to veterans' issues. They spent 40 years volunteering with military charities, and they always said that the country's treatment of its veterans was a measure of its character." Charles listened as the family described Thomas and Helen's work with homeless veterans, their advocacy for improved mental health services, and their annual efforts to organize memorial trips like the one that had ended in tragedy. What emerged was a picture of 2 people who had spent their retirement years working tirelessly to support others who had served, often using their own modest pension to fund programs that couldn't find official support. "They mortgaged their house twice to keep a veterans shelter open in Birmingham," Susan explained. "When government funding was cut, they couldn't bear the thought of those men sleeping rough again. So they put their own security at risk to bridge the gap until new funding could be found." The story was both inspiring and troubling, because it highlighted the degree to which essential support for veterans had become dependent on the charity and personal sacrifice of individuals like the Richardsons, rather than systematic government provision. Charles made careful notes, recognizing that this was exactly the kind of issue that Patricia Henley had urged him to address in a meaningful way. "What would your parents have wanted to see change?" he asked. "If they could have waved a magic wand and fixed one thing about how the country supports its veterans, what would it have been?" Mark Richardson, the youngest son who worked as a social worker, answered immediately. "Coordination. Dad always said that there were dozens of organizations trying to help veterans, but no one was talking to each other. A veteran might get housing help from one charity, mental health support from another, job training from a third, and financial assistance from a fourth. But nobody was looking at the whole person and what they actually needed to rebuild their life." This observation struck Charles as particularly important because it suggested that the problem was not necessarily a lack of resources or goodwill, but rather a lack of systematic thinking about how to deliver support effectively. He made a mental note to discuss this with government officials and military leadership as part of any longer-term response to the tragedy. The second meeting was with the widow and children of Captain Andrew Stewart, a 38-year-old officer who had been killed while trying to help other passengers escape from the wreckage. Andrew had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and had been working as a military liaison with veteran support organizations. His widow, Lieutenant Sarah Stewart, was herself a serving officer in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and their two children, ages 10 and 12, sat quietly beside her as she spoke about her husband's commitment to service. Andrew believed that military service created a bond between people that lasted long after they left the forces, Sarah explained. He said that once you had served together, you had an obligation to look out for each other for the rest of your lives. That's why he spent his leave time organizing these memorial trips and working with veterans' charities. The complexity of Sarah's situation was particularly striking. As a serving officer herself, she understood the risks and sacrifices of military life, but she was now facing the challenge of continuing her own military career while raising two children as a single parent and grieving the loss of her husband. Her composure during the meeting was remarkable, but Charles could see the strain in her eyes and the way her children stayed close to her side throughout the conversation. "Your Majesty," she said, "I want Andrew's death to mean something. He died trying to save other people, and that's exactly how he lived. But if his death is going to have meaning, it has to lead to real changes in how we support veterans and their families. We can't just have another inquiry that produces a report that sits on a shelf somewhere." Charles assured her that he shared that commitment, but Sarah's directness forced him to confront the gap between good intentions and practical outcomes. The British government had conducted numerous studies and reviews of veteran support services over the years, but many of the problems identified by the families he was meeting that day persisted despite official attention and promised reforms. The third meeting proved to be the most emotionally challenging of the afternoon. The Morrison family had lost both parents, 45-year-old former Army Sergeant Major Robert Morrison and his wife Claire, leaving behind 4 children ranging in age from 8 to 17. The children were being cared for by Claire's sister and brother-in-law, who had driven down from Manchester and were clearly struggling to cope with the sudden responsibility of caring for 4 traumatized children while dealing with their own grief. 17-year-old James Morrison, the eldest child, had clearly appointed himself the family spokesman. He was a serious young man who reminded Charles powerfully of the young military officers he had met over the years, determined to remain strong for others regardless of his own emotional state. "Your Majesty," James said, "my dad always told us that service members look after each other's families. He said that if anything ever happened to him, the military family would make sure we were okay. I want to believe that's true, but right now we don't know what's going to happen to us." The practical challenges facing the Morrison children were overwhelming. Their parents had died without significant life insurance. The family home was mortgaged, and there were questions about educational funding, healthcare coverage, and long-term living arrangements. Claire's sister and brother-in-law were willing to provide care, but they had 3 children of their own and limited financial resources. Charles spent nearly an hour with the Morrison family, listening to their immediate concerns and trying to understand the broader implications of their situation. James Morrison's questions were direct and practical. Would his younger siblings be able to stay in their current schools? Would there be funding for university? Would the family qualify for military survivor benefits even though Robert Morrison had left active service several years earlier? "We're not asking for charity," James said firmly.
"We just want to know that the promises Dad was made about taking care of military families actually mean something when they're needed most."
The meeting with the Morrison family crystallised something that had been building throughout Charles's day: the recognition that this tragedy was exposing fundamental gaps in the support system for military families that went far beyond immediate crisis response.
The families he was meeting were not asking for sympathy or special treatment. They were asking for the country to honor its commitments to those who had served and to ensure that military service did not leave families vulnerable to economic insecurity or social isolation. As the afternoon progressed, Charles met with 5 more families, each with their own stories of loss and their own perspectives on what needed to change. The family of former Royal Air Force pilot Jennifer Walsh spoke about the challenges facing women veterans, who often found that support services were designed primarily for male service members. The parents of 24-year-old former Royal Marine Paul Thompson discussed the difficulties young veterans faced in transitioning to civilian careers, particularly those who had been injured in service and needed extensive rehabilitation. By 6 p.m., Charles had spent more than 3 hours listening to bereaved families describe their loved ones and articulate their hopes for positive change emerging from the tragedy. The conversations had been emotionally draining, but they had also provided him with detailed insights into the challenges facing the veteran community and clear guidance about the areas where royal and government attention could make the most difference. As he prepared to leave the hotel, Charles was approached by Mrs. Dorothy Hamilton, an 82-year-old widow who had lost her son Michael in the accident. Michael had been a career soldier who had served in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Iraq and Afghanistan before retiring as a major and taking a job with a defense contractor. "Your Majesty," she said, taking his hand, "I've lived through World War II, the Cold War, and all the conflicts since then. I've seen how this country treats its service members and veterans, and I've seen how that treatment changes depending on whether there's a war going on and whether the politicians think military spending will win them votes." She paused, studying his face carefully before continuing. "What I want to know is whether you're going to remember these families and these commitments 6 months from now, when the newspapers have moved on to other stories, and when supporting veterans isn't getting you headlines anymore. Because these families, they're going to be dealing with their losses for the rest of their lives. Their children are going to grow up without parents, their spouses are going to face years of loneliness and financial struggle, and the veterans who are injured are going to need support through long and difficult recoveries." Charles met her gaze directly.
Mrs. de Folden.
"Hamilton, I give you my word that this will not be forgotten. The conversations I've had today have convinced me that we owe these families and the broader veteran community systematic changes, not just expressions of sympathy. I intend to work with the government, with military leadership, and with veteran organizations to ensure that meaningful reforms are implemented and sustained." "Mrs. Vinsu?" Hamilton nodded slowly. "I hope that's true, Your Majesty. My son believed in service above self, and he lived that principle every day of his life. The best way to honor him and all the others is to make sure that principle guides how this country treats the people who have served it." As Charles left the hotel that evening, he carried with him not just the weight of individual grief and loss, but a clear understanding of the systemic changes that would be needed to transform this tragedy into lasting positive change. The families he had met had provided him with both the moral authority and the practical knowledge needed to advocate for veterans' issues at the highest levels of government and society. The day had been emotionally exhausting, but it had also been clarifying. Charles now understood that his role in responding to this tragedy would extend far beyond the immediate ceremonial and pastoral responsibilities of kingship. He would need to use his position and influence to drive genuine reform in how the country supported its veterans and their families, and he would need to sustain that commitment long after the media attention had faded and the political pressure had diminished. By the evening of his first day meeting with families, Charles had made a decision that would surprise both his advisors and the government officials who had been coordinating the response to the tragedy. Rather than proceeding with the traditional approach of a single large memorial service followed by a gradual return to normal royal duties, he intended to use this moment to launch a comprehensive review and reform of veteran support services across the United Kingdom. The decision had crystallized during his drive back to Clarence House as he reflected on the recurring themes from his conversations with bereaved families and injured survivors. Every family had mentioned coordination problems between different support organizations. Every family had described gaps in long-term care for veterans dealing with physical injuries, mental health challenges, or economic hardship. Most significantly, every family had expressed the desire that their loved ones' deaths should contribute to meaningful change rather than simply adding to the list of tragedies that the country had endured over the years. That evening, Charles convened an emergency meeting at Clarence House with his senior advisors, representatives from the Prime Minister's office, and leadership from the Ministry of Defence. The meeting began at 8 p.m. in the King's private study, with participants seated around a conference table that had been hastily arranged to accommodate the unusual gathering. Private Secretary Sir Clive Alderton opened the meeting by reviewing the day's activities and outlining the planned schedule for the remainder of the week, which included additional family meetings, hospital visits, and a large memorial service at Westminster Abbey. But Charles interrupted before the agenda could proceed further. "I want to discuss a different approach," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that his staff had learned to recognize as a signal that significant decisions were being made. "The families I met today have convinced me that we have an opportunity to transform this tragedy into genuine progress on veteran support issues. I intend to use that opportunity fully." General Sir Richard Barrons, representing the Ministry of Defence, leaned forward with interest. Barrons was a career soldier who had served in multiple conflicts and had been appointed to his current position partly because of his reputation for honest assessment of military challenges. "Your Majesty, what specifically do you have in mind?" Charles referred to the notes he had made throughout the day, reviewing the specific issues that had been raised by multiple families. First, the coordination problem. "We have dozens of organizations providing support to veterans, but no systematic approach to ensuring that individual veterans receive comprehensive care. Second, the gaps in long-term support, particularly for families dealing with the ongoing effects of service-related injuries or trauma. Third, the economic vulnerability of military families when service members are killed or disabled. He paused, meeting the eyes of each person around the table before continuing. I propose that we establish a Royal Commission on Veteran and Military Family Support, with a mandate to conduct a comprehensive review of current services and recommend systematic reforms. I want this commission to have real authority and adequate funding to implement changes, not just to study problems that we already understand. The suggestion caught everyone in the room off guard. Royal commissions were serious governmental instruments that typically took years to complete their work and required significant political and financial commitments from multiple government departments. Establishing one in response to a single tragic accident, however devastating, was unprecedented in modern British history. Deputy Prime Minister Angela Foster, who was representing Number 10 in the meeting, spoke carefully. Your Majesty, a Royal Commission would certainly demonstrate the government's commitment to addressing these issues. However, the political and practical implications would be substantial. Such a commission would need to examine policies across multiple departments and might recommend changes that require significant new spending or reorganization of existing services.
Charles had anticipated this concern, and his response was immediate. Deputy Prime Minister, the families I met today have lost everything.
Their loved ones died in service to this country, not just during their military careers, but in their continued commitment to supporting other veterans after their service ended. The very least we can do is ensure that their deaths contribute to meaningful improvements in how we support the military community. The room was quiet as the implications of the King's proposal settled. Establishing a Royal Commission would commit the government to a multi-year process of investigation and reform that would inevitably uncover uncomfortable truths about the adequacy of current veteran support services. It would also provide a platform for advocacy organisations and bereaved families to present evidence and recommendations directly to high-level decision-makers. General Barrons was the first to respond positively. Your Majesty, speaking for the military leadership, I believe such a commission could address problems that we have been discussing internally for years. The current system evolved piecemeal over decades, and it has never been comprehensively reviewed from the perspective of the veterans and families it serves. Sir Clive Alderton raised practical concerns. Your Majesty, if you become personally associated with establishing this commission, you will be expected to remain engaged with its work throughout its duration. That could mean years of regular meetings, site visits, and public appearances related to veteran issues. It would represent a significant commitment of your time and attention. Charles nodded, understanding the implication. British monarchs traditionally avoided sustained involvement in particular policy areas that might become politically controversial. By championing a comprehensive review of veteran support services, he would be associating the Crown with specific reform recommendations that might prove expensive or difficult to implement. I understand the risks, he said, but I also understand the opportunity. The families I met today are not asking for my sympathy, they are asking for my leadership. If I cannot provide that leadership on issues related to the welfare of people who have served this country in uniform, then what exactly is the purpose of the monarchy in the modern era? The question hung in the room without an immediate answer. Finally, Deputy Prime Minister Foster spoke again, her tone more supportive than before. Your Majesty, if you are committed to this approach, the government will need to move quickly to establish the appropriate framework. A Royal Commission would need to be formally established by Parliament, with terms of reference that clearly define its scope and authority. We would also need to identify suitable commissioners who have the expertise and credibility to conduct this kind of review. Charles was prepared for this as well. I want the commission to be chaired by someone with direct military experience and recognised expertise in veteran affairs. I also wanted to include bereaved family members and injured veterans among its membership, not just academic experts and government officials. The people who have lived these challenges should have a direct voice in identifying solutions. Over the next 2 hours, the meeting evolved from a discussion of Charles's proposal to detailed planning for its implementation. By 10:30 p.m., the group had outlined a framework for establishing the Royal Commission, identified potential chairs and members, and developed a timeline for formal announcement and launch of the investigation. The Commission would be tasked with examining veteran support services across multiple domains: healthcare, mental health services, employment assistance, housing support, family services, and coordination between military and civilian agencies. It would be authorised to hold public hearings, commission research studies, and make binding recommendations for government action. Most importantly, from Charles's perspective, it would provide a permanent institutional legacy for the victims of the coach accident, ensuring that their deaths contributed to systematic improvements in how the country supported its veteran community. As the meeting concluded, Charles made one final requirement clear. I want regular updates on the Commission's progress, and I want to participate personally in key hearings and site visits. This cannot become a bureaucratic exercise that produces a report that sits on a shelf. The families I met today deserve to see real changes implemented within their lifetimes. The following morning brought the first public indication of the unusual approach Charles was taking to the tragedy. Instead of the expected announcement of memorial services and expressions of sympathy, the palace released a statement indicating that the king was proposing major reforms to veteran support services and would be working personally with government officials to ensure that meaningful changes were implemented. The announcement generated immediate reaction from veteran organizations, military families, and political leaders across the spectrum. Some praised the king's leadership and commitment to addressing long-standing problems in veteran care. Others questioned whether the monarch should be taking such an active role in policy development and whether a single tragic accident justified the expense and disruption of a major government review. But for Charles, the reaction confirmed that he had made the right decision. The tragedy had created a moment of national attention and political opportunity that might not come again for years or decades. By using that moment to advocate for systematic reform rather than merely ceremonial response, he was honoring both the victims of the accident and the broader community of veterans and military families who continued to face challenges in their daily lives. The memorial service would still be held, and the individual family meetings would continue throughout the week. But those activities would now be part of a larger commitment to ensuring that this tragedy contributed to lasting positive change, rather than simply adding to the nation's collective memory of loss and grief. As Charles prepared for another day of hospital visits and family meetings, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from many of his royal duties over the years. This was exactly the kind of work that he had imagined doing as king, using the influence and platform of the monarchy to address serious problems that affected real people in meaningful ways. The commission would take months to establish formally and years to complete its work, but its existence would serve as a constant reminder that the deaths in the coach accident had not been meaningless, and that the country's commitment to its veterans extended beyond expressions of gratitude to concrete action and sustained support. 3 days later, Westminster Abbey filled with representatives from every aspect of British military life, as the nation gathered for a memorial service that would be remembered as much for what it initiated as for what it commemorated. The ancient Gothic arches that had witnessed coronations, royal weddings, and state funerals for nearly 1,000 years now sheltered a congregation that represented both profound loss and renewed hope for positive change. Charles had spent the previous days continuing his meetings with bereaved families and injured survivors, but he had also worked with government officials and military leadership to ensure that the memorial service would serve as the formal launch of the Royal Commission on Veteran and Military Family Support. The service order included not just prayers and eulogies, but also the reading of the Commission's terms of reference and the announcement of its membership. The families of those killed in the accident occupied the front rows of the Abbey, with many of the injured survivors attending in wheelchairs or with medical support. Behind them sat representatives from veteran organisations, military units from across the Commonwealth, and government officials from the national to the local level. The congregation also included hundreds of ordinary veterans and military family members who had requested permission to attend as a demonstration of solidarity with those who had been lost. Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby opened the service with words that captured the dual purpose of the gathering. We come together today not only to mourn those we have lost, but to commit ourselves to honouring their memory through action that will benefit all who have served this nation in uniform. Today we grieve, but we also pledge that this grief will be transformed into purpose. The first reading was delivered by James Morrison, the 17-year-old who had lost both parents in the accident and had impressed Charles with his maturity and determination during their meeting earlier in the week. James read from the book of Ecclesiastes, choosing the passage about there being a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. But he prefaced the reading with his own words. My parents taught me that military service means putting the needs of others before your own needs, and putting the good of the country before your own comfort. Today we honour people who live that principle not just during their time in uniform, but throughout their lives as they work to support other veterans and military families. The best way we can honour them is to continue that work and to make sure that no veteran or military family faces their challenges alone. The young man's composure and eloquence moved the entire congregation, but his words also established the theme that would run throughout the service: the idea that remembrance must be coupled with action, and that grief must be transformed into commitment to positive change. The main eulogy was delivered by General Sir Patrick Sanders, the Chief of the General Staff, who had known several of the victims personally and had worked extensively with veteran support organizations throughout his career. Sanders spoke about the character of military service and the bonds that connected serving members, veterans, and their families across generations and conflicts. The people we commemorate today understood that military service creates obligations that extend far beyond individual tours of duty or individual conflicts, Sanders said. They understood that once you have served alongside someone, you have a responsibility to support them and their family, for as long as that support is needed. They lived that understanding through decades of volunteer work, advocacy, and personal sacrifice on behalf of their fellow veterans. Sanders then turned to the broader implications of the tragedy and the response it had generated. These deaths have reminded us that our obligations to veterans and military families must be systematic and sustained, not dependent on the charity and personal sacrifice of individuals. We owe them institutions and services that are adequate to the challenges they face, and we owe them the certainty that their service will be honoured not just with words but with concrete action to address their needs. The formal announcement of the Royal Commission came during the service when Charles rose to address the congregation. His speech had been carefully crafted to honour the victims while also articulating the vision for reform that had emerged from his conversations with bereaved families and injured survivors. The men and women we remember today died while returning from an act of remembrance, he said. They had travelled to France to honour the memory of those who had served before them, maintaining the sacred tradition of ensuring that sacrifice is never forgotten. In their deaths, they have reminded us that remembrance without action is incomplete, and that true honour requires us to care for the living as well as commemorating the dead. Charles announced that the Royal Commission would begin its work immediately, with a mandate to examine every aspect of veteran support services and recommend comprehensive reforms. He also announced that the Crown Estate would be providing initial funding for emergency support to the families affected by the accident, ensuring that they would not face financial hardship while longer-term support systems were being established. "I've met with every family affected by this tragedy," he continued, "and they have taught me that the greatest tribute we can pay to their loved ones is to ensure that their deaths contribute to lasting improvements in how this nation supports its veterans and military families." That commitment begins today, and it will continue for as long as it takes to create the comprehensive support system that our service members and veterans deserve. The service concluded with the singing of "I Vow to Thee, My Country," a hymn that had become associated with military sacrifice and service throughout the 20th century. But as the congregation rose to sing, many noticed that the printed order of service included an additional verse that had been written specifically for the occasion by the families of the accident victims.
"We vow to thee, our comrades, through all the years to come, that your sacrifice shall not be lost, your work shall not be done.
We pledge to carry forward the service that you gave to honour both the living and to sanctify the grave." The addition of this verse, written collaboratively by the bereaved families, represented something unprecedented in royal ceremonial. The incorporation of words created by those most directly affected by the tragedy being commemorated. Charles had insisted on this inclusion over the objections of palace staff who worried about breaking with liturgical tradition. Following the service, Charles participated in the ceremonial launch of the Royal Commission at a reception held in Westminster Hall. The first commissioners had been sworn in that morning, including retired General Patricia Williams as chair, 2 bereaved family members from the accident, 3 injured veterans representing different conflicts and service branches, and experts in healthcare, social services, and public administration. The Commission's first public hearing was scheduled for the following month, and Williams announced that it would focus specifically on coordination problems between different veteran support organisations. Subsequent hearings would examine mental health services, employment assistance, housing support, and family services, with a final report due within 18 months. But perhaps more importantly for the long-term success of the initiative, Charles announced that he would be establishing a new permanent role within the royal household, a special advisor on veteran affairs, who would be responsible for maintaining the Crown's engagement with veteran issues long after the Commission completed its work. The appointment went to Colonel Sarah Matthews, a retired Army officer who had lost her leg in Afghanistan and had subsequently become a prominent advocate for injured veterans. Matthews would be responsible for coordinating royal visits to veteran facilities, maintaining relationships with veteran organisations, and ensuring that the Crown remained engaged with the implementation of the Commission's recommendations. As the formal events of the day concluded, Charles made one final private visit to the hospital where several accident survivors were still recovering. He spent time with James Patterson, who had regained consciousness but was facing months of rehabilitation for his injuries. Patterson's daughter Emma was with him, and she had drawn a picture of the memorial service that she wanted to show the king. "It's beautiful, Emma," Charles said, examining the child's careful drawing of Westminster Abbey with crowds of people and British flags. "What did you think of the service today?" "I think Mummy would have liked it," Emma replied seriously. "She always said that when something bad happens, you have to try to make something good come out of it. I think the commission thing is something good coming out of something bad." The simple wisdom of a child's perspective on tragedy and hope provided a fitting conclusion to a week that had challenged everyone involved to find meaning and purpose in the midst of profound loss. As Charles prepared to leave the hospital, James Patterson asked to speak with him privately. "Your Majesty," Patterson said, his voice still weak from his injuries, "thank you for making this about more than just our accident. What you're doing with the commission, it's going to help veterans and families who don't even know they need help yet. That's what Sarah would have wanted, for her death to prevent other families from going through what we're going through." 6 months later, the Royal Commission had held its first series of public hearings and had begun to develop recommendations that would transform how the United Kingdom supported its veterans and military families. The emergency financial support that Charles had announced for the accident families had evolved into a permanent fund that provided immediate assistance to military families facing crisis situations. More significantly, the coordination problems that had been identified by multiple bereaved families had been addressed through the creation of a new Veterans Support Authority that served as a single point of contact for veterans seeking assistance with housing, healthcare, employment, or family services. The memorial garden that was established at the National Memorial Arboretum included not just commemorative plaques for those killed in the accident, but also an interactive information centre that helped visitors understand the history of British military service and the ongoing needs of the veteran community. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the tragedy was the precedent it had established for using moments of national crisis as opportunities for meaningful reform rather than simply ceremonial remembrance. Charles had demonstrated that the monarchy could play an active role in advocating for positive change while remaining above partisan politics, and he had shown that tragedy could be transformed into hope through sustained commitment to addressing the underlying problems that had been exposed. The families of those killed in the coach accident continued to participate in the Commission's work, serving as advocates and advisors to ensure that the voices of those most affected by military service remained central to policy development. Their loved ones had died returning from an act of remembrance, but their deaths had generated a new form of remembrance, one that honoured the past by improving the future. As Charles reflected on the year that had passed since the accident, he felt a deep satisfaction that the tragedy had indeed contributed to lasting positive change. The Commission would continue its work for another year, and its recommendations would take years more to fully implement, but the foundation had been laid for a comprehensive transformation of how Britain supported its veterans and military families. The memorial service at Westminster Abbey had been important for providing closure and comfort to the bereaved families, but the real tribute to those who had died was the systematic improvement in services for veterans that had emerged from their loss. They had died in service to the veteran community, and their deaths had ultimately strengthened and expanded that service in ways that would benefit thousands of military families for generations to come.